When I was 25, I had dropped out of art school a couple of years earlier, and I'd been working as a woodworker in Brooklyn, New York. I had a studio there, and I had a wood shop near my studio where I worked. And I broke off from the woodworking for a while to paint a big commissioned piece, a big landscape painting for a family in Pennsylvania. And it was the first really substantial commission I ever got. And when it was finished, I decided to take a break from the woodwork and go travel. And I went to Europe. I went to England mainly and spent almost a month there. And I traveled around, spent a lot of time in London, but I also went down to Cornwall, which is the southwestern part of England along the coast. Well, it's all coastline because it's an island. But I went to a town called Tintagel, just a little sort of bump in the road, with a famous ruin of an old castle, Tintagel Castle. And this is a place that's associated with the Arthurian legend, the legend of King Arthur, which I had read in various versions growing up and had always really liked. And when I was in college, I even wrote a paper about the historical figure who the King Arthur legend was related to, who was supposedly a Roman soldier who stayed on in England after the Romans left and fought various battles there. And I guess his name was Arthur or something close to Arthur, Arturus. They made a movie about that guy with Clive Owen and Keira Knightley, which was pretty true to the historical facts such as they're known. It's all a little hazy. But anyway, the mythological Arthur of the Round Table and all of that stuff, Camelot and whatnot, was said to have been conceived in Tintagel Castle. And his mother was Igraine, who was married to the Duke of Cornwall, and Uther Pendragon, who was a king at the time. Again, all mythological people. They didn't really exist so far as we know. Had the hots for Igraine and wanted to get with her, so to speak. And she wasn't interested in him at all. She was married. And he had the magician Merlin put a spell on him to make him look like the Duke. And while the Duke was off fighting a battle or something, Uther snuck into the castle and, posing as the Duke, got into bed with Igraine. And from this encounter came Arthur. Anyway, I went to this place in a very chilly November. The wind was blowing very hard. Tintagel is a rocky, craggy coast that faces the North Atlantic. And when the wind is blowing, it really blows. And it was cold and bitter and windy and stormy. And I was on that rocky promontory looking at that castle and was really taken with it. It's quite romantic and interesting to look at. And I took a lot of pictures and did drawings of it. And when I went back home to New York and then ultimately up to Rhode Island, when I moved back to Rhode Island, which is where I'd grown up, I began a series of paintings of the castle. And I did about 3 or 4 of them, and also quite a few drawings. And the very first ones that I did were pretty conventional. I was very young still and had some skill, but I was, still working up to it. And they were nice pictures. They were kind of traditional, realist views of this place, a little romanticized, but pretty much taken from what I had seen when I had been there. And then I went on to other things. I painted other pictures of England. I had done a lot of paintings of the city in New York. And I had my first ever solo show in Rhode Island of both of those things, of New York cityscapes and also my English landscapes, including the Tintagel pictures. That was in 1986. So 10 years later, or 9 years later, when I was living on the West Coast in California, I had been in New Mexico, where I had also been painting landscape. And I moved to California, and I lived in Berkeley and Oakland. I had a studio in Oakland. And I began doing imaginary scenes. I had been doing pretty conventional realist paintings of landscape and architecture all through my 20s. And this was in my mid-30s. I decided to break off and do not fully abstract paintings, but more expressionistic and more out of my head, less referential to real things. And I did a whole series of completely made-up scenes that were very loosely and expressively painted. And among them, I revisited the Tintagel castle image, and that was the only real place that I painted in that series. And I did a kind of dark, stormy, expressionistic picture of Tintagel Castle, seen from one of the rocky promontories and looking back at the keep. Actually, that's probably not the right term for it's the sort of cylindrical tower that's on the first outcropping of rock on the cliff. And it was a nice picture, and I was happy with it, and it sold eventually to some man in California. And then I moved on, and I started to paint realist pictures again of my family and my house and my neighborhood in Berkeley. And quite a few years went by. I moved around the country several times. I went back to the East Coast and then moved back out to Santa Fe, where I had lived previously. And in my, I guess it was in 2009, I had been painting abstractly, fully abstract paintings for a while, off and on. I actually started doing that when I was in college, and it's always been a sideline that I did alongside my realism. But in around 2008, 2009, I went back to do some more kind of abstracted landscapes. The landscape is always a little bit in and out of my abstractions. Sometimes they're fully formal, fully abstract, but often they're landscape imagery that's kind of integrated with formal elements. And a lot of times they're kind of like windows and doors. You're seeing through something out to a landscape or a scene. These windows or proscenia, whatever you want to call them, they come from an old early American device of painting especially the black ones, of painting a black surround around an image, sometimes a portrait, sometimes a landscape. I had a painting like that in my family when I was growing up, of a boat in the surf in New England, and the painter was sort of an outsider artist, but very skilled. But it's what would have been called sort of a primitive painting once upon a time. Now we call it outsider art, but there's nothing primitive about it. It's a beautifully painted thing. And it had a black oval around the picture, and it was very theatrical and sort of funereal. And I always liked that a lot, and I started putting those sort of black windows around my semi-abstracted pictures, I don't know, about 10 years ago. And so it's a reference to something that comes out of my own family tradition and my own background as a New Englander and a person of European descent. My paintings are very European and American. I mean, they go back before modernism. Even when I'm doing sort of modern-looking things, I'm referencing and thinking about paintings from the 18th and the 17th century. So that's all in my work, even when I'm doing something that seems more modern. And one of the very first paintings I made like this came from the Tintagel series. It was that same rocky cliff, and no ruin. It was sort of a view out of a window And it went through multiple iterations. I worked on that painting for 10 years off and on. I started it in 2009, and I painted one version, and then I scraped that off and painted another version, and then I did a third one. And finally, in 2019, so 10 years later, I finished it. And it had many layers of work in it. And ultimately, what it became was a view out of an imagined window in the castle in Cornwall, looking out of Tintagel Castle at the rocky promontory along the coast where it's situated. And this is Igraine'S View. And it's a hybrid painting. It has a lot of formal elements, so it's got a very abstracted, very flattened composition. There's no real sense of deep perspective in it. You're looking at a kind of a cliff and a hillside out the window with a sort of a stormy sky. And it hovers in between something completely abstract and something very literal and even narrative. And I imagined it as what Igraine, Arthur's mother, would have seen out of her window after Uther Pendragon had gone off and left her there pregnant, which she didn't know yet. And there's that heavy sort of red velvet and black curtain that's hanging at the right, and there's a sill of a window, and then there's just that cliff with the water below and the field beyond. And I didn't imagine it or plan it to be anything in particular. It just evolved over the many years that I worked on it, with layers and layers of paint being scraped off and reapplied, and then the composition changing a little by little. And ultimately, I mean, there's something, literal that I want it to convey, or which it actually began to convey to me. The painting kind of told me what it was rather than the other way around, which is how I really like it to go when I paint. I don't usually set off with a plan. I start working, and then the thing itself kind of tells me what it wants to be. But this picture it's the first in this long series of sort of window and door semi-abstractions that I've done over the past 10 years. And I don't know what to think of them. They're interesting pictures. My work is very much about the physical surface of oil paint on a ground. So there's a lot of gesture in it. I like a painterly mark where you can see evidence of the hand. I like to make the paint speak through multiple layers and glazes and reapplications and scumblings and pentimenti, all these things, to make a really rich, deep surface to the picture, even when the picture is kind of flat and abstract like this one is. Anyway, all of that is by way of explaining the long gestation and evolution of this picture. So it has a historical, mythological basis. It has an aesthetic basis in both more modern and abstract painting, but also in earlier forms on both sides of the Atlantic. In my own heritage, I'm a European descended guy, so I'm kind of referring back to where my people came from. So there's a lot going on in there. There's always a lot going on in my paintings, but they're not necessarily overtly descriptive. They're things that you have to kind of look at, and then look at again, and then look at some more. And they're often a little odd when you first see them. But I have found, and I've had it said to me, that over time, when you hang them on the wall and live with them, they don't get old. You always find something more to look at. And I found that true when I hang my own paintings in my house and look at them week after week, month after month. They're always a little different. They change with the light. They change every time you bring a new mood to them. they give you something back that's a little different from what you saw last time. And that's also very important to me. So that is the story of Igraine'S View. It's a little more complex and nuanced than some of my other paintings, just because it has so much that's gone into it over so many years. But it's one of my favorites, and it's one of the very earliest of this series that I did.